side there. So welcome back everybody for session 2, and don't worry if you didn't do any of the homework, that's absolutely fine. I'm not there's no marking to be done, and it's very sweet of those of you who write to say apologize for not being at a session but you don't feel you need to do that. Appreciate all got sort of busy lives, and many people have impromptu meetings they have to attend, or appointments they have to meet. So, but it's kind of you to write. Always good to hear from you. Let's begin with a prayer as usual. I should bring up a different prayer, but the prayer of St. Benedict is so good for our purposes, I think. So let's just gather our thoughts before we begin. Gracious and Holy Father, give us wisdom to perceive you, intelligence to understand you, diligence to seek you, patience to wait for you, eyes to behold you, a heart to meditate upon you, and a life to proclaim you, through the power of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Good. Now, I did say we were going to do, last week, we would look at both the Gospels of St. Mark and St. Matthew, and as I was preparing this, I thought that was probably a bit overambitious, partly because it's probably worth spending some time thinking a bit about what a gospel actually is, and then trying to squeeze in 2 gospels, maybe too much. Now that I realise next week this may mean that trying to do Luke and Matthew and Acts is also too much, but we'll see how we get on. I'm less anxious about Acts really, but we'll come on to that. So we're just going to focus upon the Gospels overall, and also have a bit more of an in-depth look today at the Gospel of St. Mark, which, as I'll introduce, is widely considered to be the first of the Gospels written. So, but what is a Gospel? Well, it's it might be easy to reply by saying initially, you might be inclined to reply saying, well, they're sort of biographies about Jesus of Nazareth. But it's quite clear that as you start reading these documents, that they're not operating as standard biographies, even as biographies as you might encounter them in the Roman world. You don't have a sort of in-depth account of Jesus's education or his teenage life, or what he did throughout his 20s, even. We do have some nativity stories in Matthew and Luke, of course, but Mark, which we're looking at today, takes no interest in that part of Jesus's life and jumps straight in with the baptism of Jesus and the beginning of his ministry. So it's quite clear that the focus here is quite different from ordinary biographies, although it's worth reflecting that that Luke is definitely, when he begins his gospel, which we'll come on to soon, of course, he says, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. And that's much more a sort of Greek-Roman mode of writing, and Luke's Greek is quite sophisticated too, suggesting he's writing for perhaps a slightly more well-read audience. So they're not completely different from a Roman or Greek style of writing, but it's quite clear that they are seeking to present us with a particular narrative about Jesus of Nazareth in relation to his teaching ministry, and in particular his death and resurrection. And it's probably worth saying from the outset that they weren't written with as titles with Gospel according to St. Matthew, St. John. That's an ascription later by the church, obviously tied to particular traditions within the church, and in John's Gospel, of course, reference to the beloved disciple. And that's quite unusual in Greek writing as well. So Also worth remembering, of course, that only 2 of the Gospels are attributed to 2 of the disciples, John and Matthew, and the other 2 are Luke and Mark, are considered to be assistants of the apostles, and sort of a second generation, really, writing up the memories of others. And it's also worth saying at the outset that St. Paul, whose letters predate the Gospels, it's widely thought to be the case, doesn't really make much detailed reference to aspects of Jesus's own life. We do have information about the Last Supper, his death and resurrection, and elsewhere we can think of the Transfiguration as being also important in some of the early writings. But this sort of detailed interest in Jesus's own life is something, as a written down, that obviously occurred a bit later than for the early church than was felt needed at the time of St. Paul. Who, of course, it's not to say that he didn't know some of those details. It's very possible that all these things were very much part of the oral tradition which was being shared around the early church. But of course, Paul isn't feeling the need to write down in detail what happened in Jesus's life at the time of his letters, except insofar as it served a pastoral purpose. And the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians 11 would be a good example of that, where people are misbehaving when it came to sharing the Eucharistic meal, and he invites them to sort of recall the purpose by reference to the Last Supper. So we know that those traditions are there, but it's obviously that felt later that the actual details of Jesus's life needed to be written down. And we could think of all sorts of reasons why that might have been the case. The most obvious, I think, would be that actually the church is spreading across the Mediterranean and up into Syria and east. And there's a need for those churches gathered around particular towns to have a detailed account of who Jesus was, not least because, of course, as the message spreads, there's then possibility that people start saying things about Jesus which weren't true. So there's a need to think, actually, what is our authority for teaching and for worship? And in what I just quoted to you from Luke, it's quite clear that he sees himself as collating earlier traditions, which might be suggestive of oral and spoken memories, which he's also writing down. But you get this sense, as Luke's writing, as one of the latest of the Synoptic Gospels, probably, that he's gathering together earlier traditions precisely for this purpose. That actually we need to kind of settle clearly what is to be said about Jesus. Who are these Gospels written for? Well, there are continual references to the Old Testament. So it's suggested that for a lot of these documents, that they're written for communities which would have some understanding of the Old Testament, which might suggest a sort of prevalence of Jewish Christians, or Jewish Christians who are very much at the heart of those communities, which would, of course, tie in with Paul's own ministry of always going to the synagogue first, so that there's this, at this stage, there's quite a strong bond between the synagogue and the people who went to the synagogue and the early Christian community. As I discussed last time, the break becomes, and the relationships become particularly more challenging at the time of the Jewish revolt from 66 AD onwards, and of course the collapse of Jerusalem, which becomes such a definitive moment for both the development of Judaism in the Mediterranean, but also for Christians as a distinct group, separate from Judaism. And especially when we come on to Matthew's Gospel, we'll feel some of those tensions. Matthew very much writing for people who know and understand and love the law, but also trying to see Jesus as something beyond the law, greater than the temple, greater than Moses, and of course some of those more problematic phrases for us now, certainly, where Jesus is, or Matthew's Jesus is being particularly unpleasant about the Jewish teachers. Most famously, that's at the time of Jesus' own crucifixion, where words are put into the mouth of the crowds, his blood be upon us and upon our children, which may be testament to a particularly painful experience for Matthew's community with Jewish persecution, possibly, who knows. But suffice to say, these writings aren't just purely written for Greek Christian communities out in the Mediterranean. There's still some deep association with Judaism, even if, of course, they are written in Greek rather than Aramaic, which is worth bearing in mind. Jesus speaks Aramaic. It's not impossible that he might have known bits and pieces of Greek, but we have his Aramaic is, of course, translated at certain points for the readers, suggestive of a Greek-speaking audience. But we don't have a sort of corpus of sayings from Jesus as he would have delivered them. And Jesus, like Socrates, is also, whose influence is, of course, is just so important for the West. These are two people who never wrote anything, which is worth bearing in mind. Well, lots to be said there about the importance of teaching rather than publishing. That's obviously feeds into a manic academic world where the pressure now is all upon publishing rather than teaching. But this was a world in which put a great premium upon oral teaching, and we can see that, of course, from Jesus' own life and teaching. This is a bit cheeky, I found this on the internet over the weekend, and made me laugh. This is a meme which is being used across Twitter at the moment for a whole variety of purposes, but sort of making the point that if you were asked what your favorite gospel is, a lot of the time people will say to you John's Gospel, because it's just sort of so rich in theological allusion and depth, and the ways in which it brings together such the life, the events of Jesus' life, but with such theological and personal significance for the reader. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke is perhaps sort of seen as a little bit cruder and less exciting. Even just think about the beginnings of each of the Gospels. John chapter 1 is of such poetic beauty and a sort of mystical reflection upon who Jesus was and his significance, which is, of course, a bit more exciting than, say, the beginning of Matthew with its genealogy. It is actually, the genealogy of Matthew is quite exciting, but of course this is perhaps the tendency of people to think of the synoptic gospels, synoptic just meaning seen similarly, all the gospels which are very much alike, that perhaps we underrate them, and particularly Mark, which is the shortest, and the Greek appears somewhat crude. The stories have a sort of vivacity to them, but there are points actually where the Greek is almost really quite difficult to read. It feels so crude. So Mark perhaps gets a bit of a rough ride, really, as the earliest gospel, but perhaps also the gospel which is crudest and less sophisticated theologically. I want to try and dispel that today, to try and introduce you to the drama of Mark's gospel, but also the quite theological intensity of that gospel too, which demands a response of us, actually in a way in which I don't think Luke's gospel does nearly as much, or at least if it does it in quite a different way It appeals perhaps more to the academic mind than Mark's Gospel, which is much more of a, I don't know, try and compare it to a monograph compared to a like a Tom Clancy thriller, perhaps. That's a bit crude by its own analogy, but you see what I mean. It's got its merits, which I will try and sell to you. Actually, one of the oldest fragments of the Gospels that we have is actually John's Gospel, which we can see in John Ryland's library in Manchester. Well worth a visit after the lockdown to go and see it. Here's a bit of Matthew's Gospel, parchment Papyrus 37, which is dated from AD 250. And here you can see quite the nature of these texts written out and quite dense writing. I think this is presumed to be from a parchment, possibly from a scroll. I'm not sure that's particularly clear, but it's not necessarily from a codex at this stage. As you'll have picked up already, these three accounts do look quite similar and very distinctive from John's Gospel. One of the things which really stands out when you're reading the four Gospels is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very much more set in Galilee, where Jesus lived in Nazareth, until the end, until the Passion, when, of course, he goes to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Whereas John, it's much more interlaced with scenes from Judah rather than just scenes from the north. And then there's differences between the dating of events. We could look at the crucifixion in relation to the Passover, distinctions between John and the synoptics there, and also the cleansing of the temple, which comes at a different point from the synoptics, as much earlier in the gospel. And that's led most scholars to date John as being later than the other three, also because the language is quite different. We see in particular the Jewish people referred to as the Jews as a distinct group, other group from the disciples. At points which feels quite uncomfortable to us, in fact, when you're sometimes reading it out in church. But also it's deemed to be, because it's a higher theology. What do I mean by that? Well, the sense that Jesus's divinity is much more stressed, and that's seen to be indicative of a later dating. That's not to say that all scholars agree with that. John Robinson, the Bishop of Woolwich, famously dated John as the first of the Gospels. We'll come on to John, but there are elements of John's Gospel which definitely militate against a reading which was certainly common for quite a long time, of seeing John as just a kind of mythological account of Jesus's life. There are sort of archaeological details, for instance, which suggests that the author has a very good and technical grasp of Jerusalem, and very in particular details which would suggest this is a person who's not just gone off on some sort of poetic trip. He cares about details. But on the whole, we tend to date the three Gospels as happening around and not long after the fall of the temple in AD 70, and that's partly because of Mark chapter 13, where there is reference to the desolating sacrilege, which is widely considered to be, Jesus urging people to flee from the city, and the sense that the time is coming where judgment will come upon the city, and the desolating sacrilege, referring to the destruction of the city. Of course, that's speculation. It could be that it's written as the revolt is just unraveling earlier, prior to 70, but there's an anticipation that this is all going to end very badly, and this will be a sign of God's judgment upon Jerusalem, and the faithlessness of the people. But on the whole, most scholars tend to think that the Gospels are written about 10 to 20 years after Paul's letters. And it's likely that each Gospel, once we begin to look at them a bit more closely, was broken down for use in teaching and worship, perhaps not totally dissimilarly to the way in which we use the lectionary now. So you might look at Matthew's. Matthew in particular has sort of 5 clear teaching blocks, which might be used for preparing people for baptism. Who knows? We don't have that sort of in-depth knowledge about the early church, but we do know that there's quite a lengthy preparation for baptism, certainly compared to how we tend to prepare the adults for baptism nowadays. So it's very possible that these writings were used in that way for teaching and in the context of gathering in small assemblies for worship. And for a long time, there was what we called the form critics, people like Debelius and Bultmann would be another one, who were sort of would try and delineate the true words of Jesus by sort of scraping away the traditions of that particular community, of the community of Mark or of Matthew or John, and the net result of that was to sort of try and imply really that each of the Gospels is written out of the particular needs and anxieties and stresses of that particular community, and perhaps are less trustworthy as a result, because the suggestion is that they're written with a particular purpose in mind. Matthew's community, perhaps for the battles they were having with the synagogue. But scholarship in the past 30 years has sort of moved away from that. I mean, there was this great passion, particularly in American scholarship. There was this thing called the Jesus Seminar, and I'm actually not quite sure whether it still exists, but who were all these scholars, I'm being very crude now, but they would sort of they would sit around together in their sort of with all their expertise, and they would sort of work their way through the Gospels and sort of take votes on whether they thought a saying of Jesus was authentic or not. And then they would, I think you can still get them. You can sort of get these Bibles, which are sort of which will give you the sort of highlighted in red the verses which they think are authentic Jesus, and those which are considered to be sort of later accretions in the interests of that particular community. Of course, to undertake that kind of approach to the scriptures implies that you know beforehand what were the needs of that particular community and what was considered trustworthy and what wasn't. So it does presume a certain authority in the hands of the modern New Testament scholar, which I think more recent academics have been a bit more hesitant about. Certainly there's still some who would want to, most scholars might want to say disparities between the different Gospels, in the words of Jesus, for instance, might suggest a developing tradition. But that's another thing from being able to say with any kind of concrete certainty, Jesus said this or he didn't say that. That is a sort of a rather dangerous path, I would consider, in my expert opinion, as someone who isn't a biblical scholar. But to say, I think it's fair to say that scholars more recently have been shaped by what we call redaction criticism, which has sort of moved away from trying to imagine the traditions of the early church which were shaping these texts, and instead trying to elucidate the editorial intent of each writer, and to take them seriously on their own merits and on their own terms, which has brought forth actually a sort of much more richer stream of reflection and scholarship. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because unless you're sort of going on to do extensive biblical studies, you don't really need to know the historiography of the New Testament. But at the heart of all of this and debates around all of this is, of course, what is called the synoptic problem, which I'm going to try and introduce to you very briefly. It is one of those things which has absorbed huge amounts of scholarly time and effort and writing, and there's plenty more to read about if that's something which interests you in terms of textual criticism and development. But what where it emerged really was in the 19th century, when people began to doubt what had been the long established tradition, which went all the way back to St. Augustine of Hippo, where people presumed that Matthew was the first gospel, not just because it was placed first, but that it was the kind of, it was clearly a development. It felt like it was development of Mark, or it had large chunks of Mark, but it wasn't presumed that Mark was first. The presumption was that Mark abridged Matthew's gospel into a sort of shorter, perhaps more vulgar account, accessible account, maybe, for a different community. And Luke used Matthew also to write a more polished account of Matthew's gospel, perhaps drawing upon some other traditions which were available to him. But scholars began to sort of question this, because they thought, well, Mark is a very odd abridgment. It's a bit like those Reader's Digest books when they sort of take a great novel and abridge it. If you were going to do that with Matthew's Gospel, it's a bit odd that you would cut out both the nativity story and offer such a brief account of the resurrection. The suggestion was that surely any Christian community would feel that they'd been a bit hard done by if they also had access to Luke and Matthew and the much richer accounts of Jesus's birth and of the resurrection that you see there. And as I said earlier, Mark's Greek is also unintelligible at points. It takes some careful reading to try and make sense of it. The parable of the mustard seed would be a good bit of Greek to compare across the Gospels in its quality. So it's again, it'd be a bit odd if that was an abridgment. Why would you sort of make the Greek harder? And likewise, there are questions about Luke sort of tidying up Matthew, because actually Matthew is really well structured in all sorts of ways, and particularly Matthew 5-8, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, as a clear chunk of teaching which is very coherently laid out. Why would Matthew then sort of move it about all over the place? So people then began to develop what became known as the two-source hypothesis. And hopefully you can begin to see that a bit, well, as I explain it, you'll understand the diagram on the right. And this was the suggestion, that our hypothesis, that Matthew and Luke had two sources available to them. They had Mark as the first gospel, but they also had, they hypothesized, these scholars, a collection of other sayings, a kerygma, which just means sayings, drawn from a Christian oral tradition, which they called Q. And that comes from the German Quelle, which just means source, another source, which we don't have access to. There's no documentary evidence for it, but was deemed to be a sort of key document which would explain those parts of Matthew and Luke which are similar to both of them, but which aren't available in Mark. And especially when we think of that opening from Luke, which I read to you earlier, it's not impossible that he's referring to some other writings or sayings which we don't have any access to anymore. And this hypothesis is given strength when you compare the words. So where Luke and Matthew have sort of chunks of identical words, which you don't see in Mark, but also order in Mark compared to Luke and Matthew. There are points where Luke departs from Matthew's order and he follows Mark, and likewise where Matthew departs from Luke's order, which would be suggestive of a slightly more fluid account of what they've got available in front of them. And then you've got of the 661 verses in Mark, 606 of them are found in Matthew in a virtually identical form, about half of them in Luke. People would also say, well, what you can also see emerging is a developing Christology, a sort of higher theology for who Jesus was. So whereas in Mark chapter 10, verse 18, we hear Jesus say, "Why do you call me good?" In Matthew's gospel, that becomes, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" in Matthew 19. And then in Mark, and then if you look at Mark 6:5, where there's a discussion about Jesus's power to do things, it says that in Mark's gospel, Jesus could do no mighty work here. Sorry, just water. Whereas in Matthew, that becomes he did not do many mighty works, and that story disappears altogether in Luke. So there's a suggestion that as time goes by, there's a sense in which the identity of Jesus becomes much more reluctant, or the authors become much more reluctant to include anything which suggests Jesus's pure humanity, and a much more greater emphasis upon Jesus's closeness to God. Another example of that would be on the cross, where Matthew and Mark have Jesus say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting Psalm 22, and Luke has, oh gosh, now it's just momentarily vanished from my head. Not that it is finished, that's John's Gospel. I commend into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. So perhaps that was a sign of a reluctance on Luke's part to include a verse which might suggest that Jesus felt desolate. Now, there could be all sorts of other reasons for that. I mean, Luke places much greater importance upon the Holy Spirit, and the Spirit is a theme in Luke's Gospel in a way in which it's not in Mark. But there's some sense in which scholars were trying to make sense of the different ways in which the Gospel writers were using material in front of them and what that might suggest. Another reason to suggest Mark came first is that its style is relatively undeveloped, and that Mark, for instance, uses Aramaic in a way in which the other two don't. So that would be also a strange thing to put in later into the text if Matthew had come first. The diagrams just get stranger, don't they, really, at this point? But there's also, of course, parts of Luke and Matthew which is unique to them alone. So B.H. Streeter, Bernard Hillman Streeter, who was at the Queen's College in the early 20th century, one of Oxford's great New Testament scholars, he wrote sort of the definitive English account of the synoptic problem in 1924, called the synoptic problem. And he advanced, in effect, 4 sources. Q, Mark, and what he called L and M, which was sort of a collection of sayings which were unique to Luke and Matthew. Like the road to Emmaus would be an example of parts of Luke's gospel which is not in Matthew or in Mark. So where did Luke get those from? As you can see, it quickly becomes a sort of quite a minefield and a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, which you can never quite fully find the answer to, and it remains a source of great disputes. I mean, more recently, I think Q sort of went out of fashion and came back into fashion. But on the whole, scholars are much more resistant to this idea that that the writers had a sort of collection of writings all before them, that they were sort of using scissors and paste approach and sort of sticking it all together in front of them. I mean, the suggestion that Luke had a sort of collection of L, and he sort of took some from that pile and some from Matthew and some from Mark and some from Q, and then put it all together. Did people manage documents and writing in that way in the past? And of course, that doesn't really take into account the importance of oral tradition. And that's definitely something which scholarship more recently in the past 20 or 30 years has really explored how important in Second Temple Judaism was oral communication and storytelling, but also the ongoing what's the word, solidity of that tradition, that it was very important that it wasn't just Chinese whispers, that in fact that as the oral tradition was passed down, it was passed down coherently. Yeah, the Germans, as it is, tend to stick to the Q hypothesis, but English theology since Austin Farrer, but then John Muddiman and Mark Goodacre. John Muddiman, who's just died, sadly, a wonderful man in Oxford, but his pupil, Mark Goodacre, maintained that Luke revised Matthew, which would certainly help explain instances where both Matthew and Luke revise a story of Mark. But in truth, we don't really know the process of editing to have any firm conclusions. But I think it's probably helpful when you notice similarities and differences in the texts to at least ask yourself, why might that be? What's important to Luke, and why has he, or Matthew, and why has he arranged his material in this particular way? And what does that tell us about his portrait of Jesus? And I suppose there's a question here about, well, if these really are just kind of impressionistic portraits of Jesus, can they be trusted at all? Especially once you start sort of taking them apart and saying, oh, that's an addition, or Matthew put in that verse because he was trying to satisfy that group, or whatever it might be. And I think that doesn't quite do justice to the way in which the texts communicate something beyond themselves. And what do I mean by that? Well, I don't think we have the direct sayings of Jesus sometimes, because we don't have the Aramaic. So we don't actually, I mean, there's even just the process of translation from Aramaic to Greek, of course, that is a process of interpretation. But that's not to say that we haven't got a reliable tradition which still is consistent with what Paul knew about Jesus, or what the early church sought to say about Jesus. Not least because, if these are written by close colleagues of the disciples, for instance, why would they include so many stories which actually speak against them and their own failures? For one thing, would be one point I'd like to make, but also that there are also surprising consistency between them in terms of the person who I think is communicated via these three Gospels, and true of John's Gospel too. In particular, I suppose, the events of the Passion and the Last Supper. Even the most liberal scholars, I think, would want to say, what we know of Jesus for certain is that he died, that he taught, and that he saw his death as significant for the coming kingdom. And that's sort of backed up, I suppose, by suggestions in other early texts that Christians were commemorating his death by this meal, by bread and wine, by this sort of prophetic symbolic action. So even for those who I think are the greatest skeptics amongst the scholars, we'd want to say that there is a historical Jesus present within the text, and that there are sufficient similarities between them that we can actually sort of piece together a tradition which is coherent and in the broader sense trustworthy. Of course, I mean, I think Christians would want to say that Jesus doesn't purely speak through text. He speaks to us through his Spirit, who communicates to us through the tradition. And of course, that's expected of the people who are engaging with these writings, which takes us, I think, into an example which will hopefully kind of outline what I mean by all of that in a bit more clarity. In that, they're not written as sort of historical biographies, which goes back to what I was saying, but they're invitations into an engagement with Christ, who is present not just in texts, but in the community, in and via the Spirit. And let's explore that a bit now by relation to the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark is identified in the tradition as Peter's interpreter by Papias, a 2nd century writer, and that's backed up by later authors, Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria. Of course, we don't know that for sure, but there are sort of interesting details in Mark's Gospel, and what a detailed account of Peter's call, and the healing of Peter's mother-in-law in chapter 1, which might suggest that this person was close to Peter, and therefore that is probably true. Others say that's nonsense because look at the way in which Peter's treated as a bit of an idiot in Mark's Gospel, and I think that sort of presumes, therefore, that Peter couldn't perceive the possibility that he could have a story written about Jesus which reflected badly on him, which I think is probably a bit unfair on Peter in the early church. And there's no reason to suggest that Peter was quite willing to talk about his own failings and weaknesses in relation to his own discipleship, and that has actually been really important for his own teaching ministry and talking about Jesus's faithfulness. So I think that seems a bit of a facetious distinction to make. There's a great focus in Mark's Gospel upon suffering, and there's knowledge of the Roman world, which might suggest that it was indeed written in Rome in Peter's final days, where, of course, Christians were facing very serious persecution. But persecution was also known, of course, way out east in Palestine and Syria. Some people think Mark was written in Antioch, where Christians were also under attack, and of course the Jews themselves were obviously facing, but not exactly popular by this point, in terms of their own rebellion against the Roman authorities. And the Aramaic is, of course, translated into Greek. I mean, he uses Aramaic, but he does translate it. So it does suggest that at least that he was in a community which was Greek speaking. I mean, it is written in Greek, but he needs to make that clear. He can't presume that the people he's writing this for would have readily understood the Aramaic, which might suggest it's not actually written for someone. It's not Jerusalem based. And of course, as I say, that reference in Mark 13 to the desolating sacrilege and to the collapse of Jerusalem and the order, the order of the temple and of the high priesthood and so on, is cognizance of the fact that that rebellion is underway, that he might be writing this in a time of apocalyptic expectation, that in fact these wars which were overtaking the life of Judah and Jerusalem and the religious political settlements that had been established there for since the Herodian kings, meant that the end was now in sight. So suggestive of someone who was out east. And as we look at all the Gospels, I remember my New Testament teacher, David Wenham, would always say, always look carefully at the bookends. They'll tell you a lot about the Gospel. And I think that's certainly true of Mark. He dives straight in, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And it's clear this isn't just the beginning of a story. It's the beginning of something which is much broader than just the narrative itself. You're being invited into the good news about Jesus, Ho Christos, the Christ, the Messiah, who is the Son of God. It's rooted in the preaching of the apostles, and quite different in that sense from a Roman or Greek approach to a biography. You're being invited into the good news of the kingdom come, and the forgiveness of sins, and this as communicated through the life and the teaching of Jesus and his death and his resurrection. And then look at the end, which is perhaps the strangest ending of the Gospels. You'll notice hopefully in your Bibles that with Mark's Gospel, they make a break in chapter 16 where they make it clear that the final section of the Gospel from verses 9 to 20 are not included in the earliest manuscripts, and that's the longer ending of Mark is seen to be a later addition, and that the original Gospel ends with the women at the tomb. I'll read it. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's a really odd place to end. We don't actually see in the original a vision of the risen Jesus. We see the empty tomb and the women being told that he has been raised. He's not here. Tell the disciples and Peter that they've got to go ahead to Galilee, and there they'll see him just as he told them. But it's such an intriguing ending, kind of almost asking of us, like, what is our response to this moment, to the empty tomb? How are we going to respond to the good news in our own lives now? And in that sense, but the bookends do underline the degree to which Mark is a very lively narrative about our response, and our regularly failed response, to recognize Jesus for who he is. And it's broken up in a variety of ways by different scholars, but most people would see the key verse as being chapter 8, verse 26, where Jesus says, from 8:27, where Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And that seemed to be, by most people, a sort of turning point in terms of this question throughout Mark's Gospel of who do you say that I am? And a sort of unfolding narrative which is inviting us to see Jesus for who he is, both through his healings and his relationship with the Jews, and in the earliest section in chapter 1, following his baptism, and then with his own in Nazareth, and alongside his own teaching, how people respond to his teaching. And then Mark sort of focuses it down into the disciples, in particular with the story of the parable of the sower, where he explains to him why he's speaking in parables, that these stories grant them the secret of the kingdom, which that indeed many will look but not perceive. This is in chapter 4. Many will indeed listen but not understand, which is indicative of what we're being invited to think about. Like, do we hear and respond? Do we see and perceive? And do we listen and understand? And of course, even though Peter understands, what becomes quickly apparent is that he's actually failed to understand, even after he confesses Jesus as the Christ. He immediately fails to reckon who he is at the Transfiguration. And likewise, the disciples carry on misunderstanding what he means by the coming kingdom. And when he talks about his own death and resurrection, where they say, stop talking about this. We don't like it when you you give us these. Why do you keep talking about your impending death? Then they're not understanding. And in fact, as it goes on, they're even more interested about when in the coming kingdom, in having the finest seats in the kingdom, having authority and power in this new Davidic kingdom. And Jesus constantly rebuking them and then failing to understand. And then sort of tied to the healing of blind Bartimaeus as a sort of a story which tells us what it is to see and what it is to be blind. That Bartimaeus, who is given sight by his faith and recognizing who he is. Most chiefly exemplified, I suppose, in the centurion at his death. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Even as the disciples fail in the final stages to recognize who he is, and Peter's denial of him in chapter 14. So the question, as you read through it, is how do we, despite our own failures, recognize and respond to Jesus and to the new world that the resurrection ushers in? I mean, the response of the women is interesting, isn't it? It's not that they go and do as he commands. They're afraid. And of course, that would have been the experience, I imagine, for many Christians for whom Mark was writing, experiencing appalling persecution, their faith being tested in all sorts of ways, all sorts of questions about perceiving but not understanding, having trust that despite the turmoil that they saw around them, that God was active and his kingdom had been ushered in through Jesus's death. I haven't left much time to talk about the kingdom of God, but that is such an important theme for both Mark's gospel and the other synoptics. It appears over 100 times in the synoptics, only gets sort of passing reference in John's gospel. But emerging out of sort of post-exilic thought, in Hebrew thought, we can look at the later chapters of Isaiah, an idea, suggestion that a time would come where God would decisively act and the nations would come to Israel, a restored kingdom, in which a new king would fulfill the original purpose, the original promise to David and to his successors, where the occupying forces would be ushered out and God's authority would come in for all of creation, that Israel would have a sort of oversight of the whole world. And in Daniel's, the book of Daniel, that later writing, that's 2nd century, there was a growing expectation that this would happen after a kind of cosmic battle, that this would be ushered in by angelic forces, by a sort of unveiling of God's power from heaven. And there is particular interest around Daniel's reference in chapter 9 to 70 weeks of years, which is interpreted as by many as 490 years after debated dates, but considered to be after the exile. And so there was an expectation in the time of Jesus that God was about to act decisively. People were absolutely fascinated by numerology in some of these texts, and great debate about what would be the key moment, when would that 70 weeks of years be completed. And likewise, early Christians would place Jesus' own death within that chronology, and that when Jesus comes into Jerusalem and he's acclaimed as the Son of David, that behind all that is that expectation about a coming kingdom and about the overturning of foreign occupation of Abraham's promised land, and the renewal of all things under God's King. So, and we see this again and again through the Gospels, where the disciples are constantly imagining that sort of king. And not just, we can see that in John's Gospel too, where the crowd want to make him king. In Mark's Gospel, there's the messianic secret. Jesus keeps saying to them, don't tell anyone that I'm the Christ, which is peculiar to Mark, but perhaps suggestive of this sense of the kind of king that was coming was not one as they perceived it to be within their own expectations of the time. Jesus's kingship is going to be achieved through his death and through his own life being a ransom for many. And that's still tied up with some of these ideas about the apocalyptic. In particular, in Mark's Gospel, this idea that the strong man, that the devil has to be bound, and the devil is bound through his own death, and through Jesus's own death, acting as a ransom, delivering people from their being held by this kind of cosmic imprisonment, evinced in Jesus's own healing miracles. In fact, this morning the gospel was Mark 5, and the story of Legion, the demons gripping the demoniac, but even the demons recognize Jesus for who he is, and they plead with him to let us go into these unclean animals, these pigs. They probably sort of run off the cliff edge, but a sign that Jesus is coming as an apocalyptic figure as well. He is bringing judgment and bringing in this element of crisis, where the authorities and powers that bind this world can no longer be sustained. So this is a lovely depiction of Mark chapter 16 by William Blake, The Three Marys at the Sepulchre. And this was actually a story which absolutely fascinated William Blake, who of course was very interested in the personal response to the spirits of the risen Jesus in ways which were pretty heterodox for his time. But it does capture some of the imaginative power of Mark's Gospel. That the question is, are we left afraid, or will we respond with understanding? Will we be able to read the signs of the times? Will we be able to hear the parables and respond to them? Or are we like the seed which just gets blown away in the wind? Are we able to see the death of Jesus for what it is, and the empty tomb for what it is? So it's from this perspective, that's what I'm trying to sort of hopefully convey to you, is that we shouldn't see Mark's Gospel as a sort of crude first draft on the Gospel of Jesus. It's actually a very lively and powerful, passionate invitation to encounter and respond to Jesus in a time of suffering, in a time of distress, in a time of confusion, and for us to respond like Peter and say, "You are the Christ. In you and in your kingdom, we put our trust." Not in the political machinations which no doubt Mark would have known in his own day. All sorts of questions about God's faithfulness, and Mark wanting to say God has been faithful. Trust in this good news. Don't be afraid. Not another expression which keeps cropping up in Mark's Gospel, indeed across the Synoptic Gospels. Do not be afraid, which of course would have been deeply felt by all the early Christians in this time of unsettlement across the Roman Empire for both Jews and for the early Christians. If you want to go further with Mark's Gospel, there's a good 8-course session from Yale Divinity School. I'll send all these later. And you can also listen to them as podcasts, I've since found out. That's from Apple, but I'm sure available from all good podcast providers. But they're only short, about 50 minutes each, so you could even listen to one a day in between our next sessions. And if you're looking for good commentaries, I was having a look on Amazon, the evil Amazon, I'm afraid, but it's quite hard to find what I think are my two favourites, which are by Morna Hooker, who was at Cambridge for many years, and Francis Maloney, who's a Jesuit. They're ones I really value, but I couldn't find the Francis Maloney on Amazon at least, and Morna Hooker's now seems to cost £45, but I'm sure if you there certainly must be second-hand copies around, and Morna Hooker's written more widely on Mark's Gospel, so definitely just kind of putting in into Google Morna Hooker Gospel of St Mark if you want to find out more. Next week, sorry I've gone on too long, we're going to look at Luke and Matthew. So I thought rather than recommend you read a whole or one of those Gospels, you're very welcome to do if you've got the time, of course, but you might like to read the passion narratives in both books and just notice the differences between them, and just reflect upon what those differences might suggest to you about both of those portraits of Jesus. You can also listen to David Suchet read the Gospel, the whole Bible, in fact, but there's quite a lot on YouTube at the moment of his reading that. And there's also, I think, of him doing it at St Paul's Cathedral too, which is rather nice. But if you've got 2 hours to spare, I really recommend sitting down and watching, which is on YouTube at the moment, Paolo Pasolini's 1964 film, The Gospel According to St Matthew. Pasolini was a Marxist, an atheist, homosexual. You wouldn't think he was the kind of person who would make a film like this, but he dedicated it to John the 23rd, who in the Second Vatican Council sort of urged this rapprochement between Catholics and non-Catholic artists, and it was out of that invitation that Pasolini made this very careful scene by scene, chapter by chapter rendition of the Gospel, and the Vatican newspaper reckoned it in 2015 to be the best film ever made about the life of Jesus. So definitely, I'll send the links to you. It's sort of hypnotic. It's hard to describe. It's unlike any other film. I'm sure many of you have seen it, but that would be a good way to use your time. I'm sorry that I blathered on as ever, but if you'd like to stay and ask questions, please do so. But if you've got to go now, of course, do head off. Feel free to. Oh, here we go, Robin. Great.